for the introduction, and to Louie for the invitation to join today. I know everyone is really here to hear Louie talk about his wonderful body of work, so I won't speak for too long, but I have some kind of broader, I guess, framing points for us to think about Louie's work through. So today, inspired by Louie's very large and significant body of work on mining, I want to ask a simple question. What does mining tell us about the history of photography? And I think this question might, at first glance, sound a bit strange, but there's actually very long and significant material links. And it's this material and social connection between mining and photography, which lies at the heart of my research. And it centers on a simple premise. The mine is a precondition for photography. Over the course of the 20th century, photography used an estimated 25% of the silver produced worldwide. Since the popularization of photography, the primary light-sensitive material in analog photographs has been silver. Silver bullion is chemically reduced to silver halides, which produce salts that are light-sensitive. Once exposed to light, the halides darken, fixing the image. So in a sense, the photograph is light solidified in silver. Other metals and minerals are used in photographic processes, but silver halides are by far the most common in film photography. We can, of course, think of the dominance of the silver gelatin print. And it's the light sensitivity of silver halides that allows for short exposure times, providing for generations the only viable way of capturing a negative instantaneously in the camera. As Kodak summarized, without silver, there would be no photography. So photography's mineral reliance dates back to the origins of the medium. In 1863, Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the earliest theorists of photography, who wrote extensively about the medium for the Atlantic, vividly described a visit to a photographic supply factory. And in it, he summarized that annually, photographic industries in the United States use 10 tons of silver and half a ton of gold. Holmes also noted photography's industrial nature. The factory was powered by steam and the labor was subdivided. So there's a sort of proto-assembly line division of labor shown in these illustrations, which were also heavily divided along gender lines, with men doing work that was perceived as more skilled. But so this demand for materials and the industrial nature of the medium continued to escalate as photography became a mass medium by the end of the 19th century. But metals and minerals are not the only materials used to make photographs. As Kodak summarized, film is animal, vegetable, mineral, borrowing the slogan of The Alchemist. On the slide, we see cotton, gelatin, and silver identified as primary ingredients. To explain, plant fibers like cotton and linen became photographic paper. Eggs coated albumin prints, while the gelatin in film stock came from the skin, bones, and connective tissue of cattle, sheep, and pigs. Eventually, the demand was so high that slaughterhouses became integrated into the photographic production chain. Indeed, controlling the supply chain of materials was really key to Kodak's success. In one kind of infamous example, in 1882, as Kodak began to grow, widespread complaints of fogged and darkened plates stopped production. The issue was in the gelatin, but scientists couldn't locate the root cause. The crisis almost ruined Kodak financially, just as they were starting out as a company, and resulted in the company tightly monitoring supply chains. Decades later, a Kodak emulsion scientist discovered that cattle who consumed mustard seed metabolized a sulfuric substance which enhanced the light sensitivity of silver halides, which enabled better film speeds. So the poor quality gelatin in 1882 was actually due to a lack of mustard seed in the cow's diet. The head of research at Kodak concluded if the cows didn't like mustard, there would be no movies at all. So by controlling the diet of the cows used to make gelatin, Kodak ensured the quality of its film stock. So in one sense, the image comes alive through animal death, carried along by the work of ranchers, meat packers, and Kodak production workers. Photography is also synthetic. In many ways, Kodak was a chemicals company, and film was the earliest widespread use of plastic. So these material realities of production undermine many of the stories photography likes to tell about itself, whether its ease, its lack of mediation, or its non-organic technological sophistication. Photography has long been invested in appearing immaterial, a lightness, pure vision, unchained from the earthly work of production and reproduction. Photography is, of course, not alone in this desire to transcend a sort of banal materiality. Artists often try and overcome the limitations of paint and canvas to create something more meaningful, producing a rift between the object and the masterpiece, which is located in the immaterial idea. But photography promises the possibility of an unmediated lens onto the world. Of all mediums, it is the most effective at concealing its materiality. But this materiality is quite significant. By the 1950s, Kodak was using 2 tons of silver per day. That's about 4,000 pounds. And it's dramatized in this incredible Life ad, which shows their famous silver vault. So here, Kodak tells us that silver bullion and the film negative are the same substance, pure metallic silver. And superimposed over the image is this magnified insert, revealing these filamentary threads of pure metallic silver entangled on the paper. So here, the treasure behind your snapshot is directly depicted. We see the photograph and the silver that forms the print, the image and its material basis. Elsewhere, Kodak reflected, to dig metal out of the dark earth, flash light on it for a tiny fraction of a second, and obtain a picture marvelously rich in detail and texture, there's a touch of the miraculous in there, isn't it? And it's this emphasis on the miraculous nature of photography, which directs attention to photography's alchemical connotations, which transform pure silver bullion into the silver halides that form the blackened traces of silver that set the photographic print. But vast amounts of earthly materials have to be dredged up to make photography seem weightless. So to summarize, the history of photography is in one sense a history of the mine. Silver has to be dug out of the dark earth before it can be used in photography. In the Kodak ad, however, we see the raw material, not the labor that extracts or transforms it. And so the quote names a chain of photographic production, the mine, the darkroom, the print. But the focus throughout is on the magic metal, not the labor required to process and transform the raw material. Indeed, Kodak required an incredible amount of labor to meet the burgeoning demand for home photography. But the massive chains of work making photography possible were rarely made visible, subsumed under the heading of the rest in Kodak's famous slogan, "You push the button, we do the rest." So to scale up the production of photography, Kodak swept all of the work that made it possible out of the viewfinder. So as a medium, photography has long elected to emphasize immateriality, specifically often the sort of autogenic power of the sun, over the messy, chemical, and often toxic work of the darkroom and the complex sites of production that lead to that point, including the mine and the factory. This continues into the present. Adobe's most popular photo editing software is called Lightroom, while our images are stored on the cloud, which, despite the sort of fluffy abstraction it promises, is energy hungry and resource intensive. So this seductive fantasy that the world has become altogether networked and dematerialized is only possible because corporations deliberately aim to obscure the labor of extraction and its environmental costs. but a shadow history of labor haunts the history of photography. And this is what Louie Palu's Cage Call brings into view in dialogue with earlier projects like Timothy O'Sullivan's photographs of Comstock Lode or David Goldblatt's images of South Africa. The Cage Call is especially interesting as it was taken at a moment of critical transition for both mining and photography at the end of the 20th century. Indeed, the demand for silver in photography actually peaked in 1999. But there's this context, right? The twilight of two industries being eclipsed by automation and technology. This is the era of NAFTA. We see the increasing dominance of multinational corporations. Increased mechanization and technological expansion weaken labor power. The 90s is, of course, also the end of the analog photography era, framed by many at the time as the end of photography. And so Palu's sort of insistently materialist framing was in some ways out of step with the period, where the predominant narrative was the world had changed. But 30 years later, we can conclude that Palu captured a period of transition that resulted in a scaling up rather than endings. Technology, rather than reducing our reliance on extraction, has actually greatly increased it. While the world's population has doubled since the 1970s, resource extraction has tripled, and much of this demand is fueled by technologies. Across Canada, mines, many of the ones that Louie photographed, continue to supply critical metals that power our networked world. Photography, in the form of data being transmitted between devices, is another significant driver of extraction and energy use. Digital photography is actually much more mineral intensive than analog images. 84% of the stable elements on the periodic table are used in a smartphone, while the infrastructure to store, edit, and share photographs requires further mined materials and fossil fuels. Digital photographies, in turn, have made photographs both more ubiquitous and more energy intensive. Now, trillions of photographs are taken annually on smartphones. So this history documented in Cage Call is more critical than ever. But it's a history we're often reluctant to confront in a tangible, material way. And so for all of these reasons, there's a lot of interest in extraction right now. But Palu nuances the growing body of work on photography's material foundations by directing our attention to labor as the central axis of mining. Too often, when we talk about extraction, we can, well, abstract it. As Rob Nixon reminds us, capital abstracts in order to extract. And using extraction as a metaphor for any system of value where capitalism takes from us can inadvertently replicate these violent abstractions of capital. Instead, Palu's fusion of the mine and photography invite a reflection on the complicity of artists and art institutions with the forces of global capitalism. But it also invites us to reconsider these histories, to engage with them head on. In doing so, we allow the political histories of the social life of photography to return to the center of the frame. These are histories that have always been there. We just haven't always wanted to face them. And understanding these histories is significant because the visual has long been a critical site for constructing meaning and making sense of the world. Exploring the role played by materials in photography allows us to consider how these images help us make sense of the social relations that structure our world. As a result, they're an invitation to slow down and look closely at histories we often cast out of view, to diagnose the historical roots of our current crisis so that collectively we can chart more just paths forward. And this is the spirit with which Palu turns our attention to the material consequences of our image culture. Not to suggest that photography is a sort of vampire extracting resources from the earth, or that ethically there's no way out, but rather to highlight how many places we can possibly intervene. In Palu's body of work, we get glimpses into the solidarities that are possible, like this photograph of a mine mill strike. Read one way, the collective labor organizing of miners is also part of the history of photography, which then becomes an invitation to all of us for collective action. Page Call is at its heart about photography itself, about the raw materials that make the medium possible and the environmental violence and physical labor which underlie that possibility. And these are the histories that Palu brings back into the frame. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Louie to walk us through the work.
Well, that was awesome, Siobhan. I just want to say, I feel like when Siobhan talks about my work, it's like I'm at a therapy session. Like, that's what my brain is saying, but I can't put into words. Siobhan, that was totally awesome. Thank you. I'm gonna just do a screen share now. Anyway, thank you, LACP, for hosting this. I think it's listening to Siobhan talk about this. I think, especially with the strike that just happened in Los Angeles, just thinking about labor and the materials that went into the filmmaking, as Los Angeles is this like world center of cinema, and the materials and the labor that goes into making the materials that the actors and the screenwriters and everyone else uses, even digital today. So I think there's this great sort of connection right now with what's going on in sort of workers' rights in the face of technology and sort of digital materials. Anyway, let's go right into the slide. So I had I started this project in 1991. I got it at art school. I was an intern to Mary Ellen Mark. People ask me why I shot black and white, because I could process it on my own and it was just cheaper. Also, I'm not sure I really had the sophistication to work in color at the time. So 1991, I finished my internship in New York. I grew up in Toronto. I went back to Toronto and I thought, what am I going to do? And I'll be honest, I wasn't really interested in taking photographs for magazines. I really just wanted to do a self-directed project. And I was thinking in the lines of sort of at the time, like books, like Robert Frank's The Americans, sort of these self-directed projects. This is an installation view of the exhibition, which ends today in Toronto at the Image Center. But so today's kind of a nice bookend to it, not only geographically, but also on the dates of the exhibition. This is just so I can explain the relationship. Siobhan is one of the only true witnesses of me working on this. I worked with Siobhan's father, who was a journalist at the time. He's a federal politician in the Canadian government now. But Charlie was a writer. And I met Siobhan when, I don't know how, she was quite small, and she grew into this super smart, incredible person. But she was just watching us work, going out into the field, talking about mining. And for people who don't know, Siobhan grew up in cobalt, which, in the early days of Kodak would have been the center of world silver mining. And both her great-grandfathers were miners in a gold mining town north of there called Timmins. So Siobhan is actually one of these rare people who has a personal connection growing up in a mining town and growing up in Cobalt, Ontario. And if you want to look it up, it's about 5 hours north of Toronto. Growing up in it after the mining was all over. So she's growing up in the aftermath of all these old mine sites that are no longer working, and the population once being 30,000 and now 1,000. So Siobhan has a personal connection to not only the industry and the history of it, but she grew up watching me produce all this work. I was from Toronto, so I stayed at their house all the time. I dug up some nuggets because I did do a lecture for the Image Center when we had the show, and I thought the content should be very, very different. So I'm really excited I dug hard. This is me underground sometime in the 90s, just so you can see how cramped the conditions are. I had on-camera flash, off-camera flash, and if you look at the photograph, see that lamp on my helmet? If I didn't use flash, the only thing you'd see in the photograph is the lamp, and you'd have to expose quite slow, like 30th of a second at f8, 400. And I'm shooting 400. Like, we have digital cameras that shoot like 3000 ISO. Back then it was maybe 800 if you're lucky, and there's no light. So the very nature of photography's tools itself allow us to see the mind. So this is my late darkroom. When we think about photography, analog photography, we think of the darkroom. This is my late darkroom printer, who I used to collaborate with, Andre Laredo, printing. This is in Toronto at Gallery 44. I'm going to repeat a quote, Siobhan, because it's nice to see it and read it. So, silver and gold mines are the front line of the stock market and for the material possibilities of the image. So, a lot of you, if you haven't been able to read any of Siobhan's writings, she has a book out. I'll tell you about a little more later. But when we look at numbers, the Toronto Stock Exchange, a lot of people don't know this, has more mining companies listed on it than any stock exchange in the world. Toronto is like, you want to build a mine, which costs millions of dollars, you need loans from banks. You go to Toronto. That's pretty much where you go. Selling the metals later, it's always been globalized. So we think of globalization kind of coming, sort of post 90s. Mining has been globalization for decades, if not centuries. So anyway, let's understand the scale of the mining, at least in Cobalt, Ontario, which was a silver mining center. There were literally sidewalks of silver when they found silver there. So this is like well over 100 years ago. And as you can see that little ladder in the middle there, that's the scale of, this is just a section of the open cut mining or open pit mining, whatever you want to call it. I mean, you can still see these scenes now. These are fenced off mine workings. Up at the top of this, you can see little trees up top. These photographs were taken in the early 90s. And when I first started thinking about this project, my father was a stone quarryman. He was working in a town called Kirkland Lake. Kirkland Lake is one of these many sort of outposts in northern Ontario and Quebec that a lot of people in the world don't know about, let alone people in Toronto or in Canada. And really, these are resource extraction sites where people build their lives and their homes around the site of work, single industry towns. And what struck me was the need for explosives to blast the rock. It's just the scale of how they did things, and sort of this humans against this like massive body of hard rock. When we think of mining, a lot of the imagery in the history of photography is coal mining. This is hard rock mining, very separate and different industry. This is for making metals. Coal is for making energy. And though they intersect now with the making of digital parts and the energy to run them, hard rock mining, at least for a long time, is like gold, copper, nickel, uranium. These are all things. Canada's like in the top 3 of metal producers. What also struck me, as I started doing the field work, and then I eventually met Charlie Angus, my writing partner for many years, is you'd go to like a community hall, like at this Italian club, and there was like the widow's table. These things as a photojournalist, as a documentary photography, really, really struck me. And, they became lines of investigation for me. You're wondering like, oh, whoa, wait, this is looks like a rectangle, because normally I used only a square format for a long time for the photographs. This was done on assignment. It was a strike in 2010. And we also want to think of how cameras are used in labor as weapons. These are strike breakers. These are private security guards hired by companies to intimidate and record workers and try and have them charged by the police or instigate violence or just intimidate them, follow them home, film them, and in turn, union members taking photographs of workers who are crossing the picket lines. So this was from what the union members called a scab book. So photography as a weapon in labor disputes. So before we get into the mining work, let's just understand the kind of photographer I am so I can introduce you to kind of work I'm interested in, the kind of things I'm focused on. So I've been a photographer for 30 years. I grew up in Canada. I now live in the United States. I've lived here in Washington, D.C. for around just over 17 years. My parents were Italian immigrants, came to Canada in the aftermath of the Second World War. So kind of I grew up hearing stories of the Second World War. Things I've worked on, these are sort of just, you can see a lot of this stuff on the website. The border, organized crime, migration across the border, and the level of killing going on in Mexico. I've covered Guantanamo Bay. This is something I did with the New York Times. I covered Afghanistan for about 5 years. I'm still working on this project in the Arctic. This is something I did with National Geographic around the whole idea of the militarization and industrialization of the Arctic in the face of climate change. After wanting to retire from war photography, I cover politics, so I have to laugh a little because I found myself in the Capitol on January 6th for a project that's still ongoing that I started from the first impeachment of the previous president and up until now, and sort of documenting this unfolding period of this hinge moment of U.S. democracy and government. So let's kind of pull all back and head right back into the mining photographs. I remember when I was getting my MFA, I went to the Maryland Institute College of Art. And I remember looking out the window of my studio and I saw this garbage bin and it was like full of art materials. And I just thought, dear God, like, I mean, we all have garbage we throw out. But I just looked at all those canvases and paints and metals and cement and sculpture materials. And I thought, it's not a calling out of what we do. It's just, and it's not even a moment where I want it to be a moment so much of a reckoning. I'm not sure I like that word, but I think it's just an acknowledgement. And I think it's funny when I used to propose exhibiting my mining work to like, you should show that in the science museum. It's like the art museums were like, we don't want to talk about that. And I just feel like, hey, I think we do want to talk about it. I think it's good to say, hey, we're a part of this and how can we intervene and do this a little better? So I got a great quote from Charlie Angus, who I work with, is sort of most of the mine has to be imagined. You can see the building on top and maybe a view of a miner underground, but you can't see the whole mine because it's underground. So let's understand sort of the standard underground mine. Most of the mines in Canada are underground. So there's a mine shaft. So there's the blue sky. To the left, you're seeing there's an open pit. It can start like that. And you see those vertical lines are the mine shaft. So, and there's those little black buildings at top. And now, if you don't know about Toronto, there's the CN Tower, so you can see for height. So we're looking at 2 kilometers. A mile is 1.7 kilometers, but you get how deep this goes. Some mines are even more than this. Some mines are 10,000 feet. We're at 6,800 here. So they have mine shafts, and then they have horizontal tunnels called drifts. And that gold colored thing is the ore. That's the rock with the metal you want to get. This is the Creighton mine. It's a nickel copper. It's a polymetallic mine. Most mines are single metal, whether it's uranium or gold, but a lot of mines in parts of Canada makes them so rich, meaning they're worth a lot, is they have, a lot of silver mining or silver photography is the byproduct of copper mining. It just because the metals come together. So it gives you an idea of what the mine structure looks like. I remember when I started this project, I studied art history. I went to art college, and obviously Diego Rivera, I mean, incredible work. I love this image called The Agitator, and there's probably a more specific to him, the artist, is in his intention. But when I looked at this photograph, I got 2 things from it in the book I was looking at in the early part of my project is, one, the agitator. He's like, look at these people resource extracting on our land, like colonial stuff. Then the other thing is like, look how bad these guys are being treated. They're literally in their underwear, underground, working in these terrible conditions. We need to organize. And I always see like the hammer and the sickle, the usual, the symbol of socialism or organization of workers. And I just thought it was like unionizing and the environment. And that's what I kind of got of the Diego Rivera work. So when I went out on the picket lines, if anyone looks up an interesting history that ties to the United States and filmmaking, you look at Sudbury, Ontario. It's 4 hours north of Toronto. It's one of the biggest nickel mining centers in the world. So nickel is used to make stainless steel. And I get to the picket line, and there's this guy with a scab hunter shirt on. I mean, look at the size of this guy. I mean, he's, so there's an inherent violence and physicality to this is my job, these are my rights. And when you look at the history of Sudbury, there's a famous film called Salt of the Earth. Anyone in film studies would pretty much know this film. If you don't, it's very much worth watching. It's one of the earliest films made by a labor union, and it's about a miners' strike I think it's in New Mexico at a copper mine. And it was made by the Mine Mill Smelter Workers Union. Now, that in the 50s, that union started getting raided by another union supported by the US government and other groups because of the whole communist scare, the Red Scare. And Hollywood went through something like this as well. And they slowly pushed or took over all these locals till only one survived. And the only local of that union that survived this sort of what they consider, the US government considered the purging of communists or socialists out of unions in the United States, survives to this day at a mine in Northern Ontario and Sudbury. So sort of the labor union, I just feel like this is the more contemporary language that people like Diego Rivera would be seeing if he went to a picket line with the agitator. So this is a picket line. We're talking strikes where there's like shooting, the use of explosives, threats, dynamite. In the 50s in Sudbury, when the company wanted to break the union, they actually went to Germany and recruited former ex-SS stormtroopers and brought them to Sudbury in Ontario, in Canada, to use them as strike breakers, just so we understand sort of the level of what's going on. This is from 1938 Kodak magazine, and I just love the silver metal money mixture. Now, I want to say for myself, I still use a lot of film. But I like knowing the history to make sure there's a silver capture in our dark room and wherever I work, and to mitigate these sort of things that come from analog photography. So I like the saga of a precious metal that is always photography's most important raw material. But I grew up with Italian immigrant parents, and I just thought, where are the workers? So that was kind of my thing. That was always my line, and I never was able to, and I don't want to sound sarcastic. I mean it honestly. Siobhan just put it in words, I think, that just so concisely explain what we should be talking about. So this is in Cobalt, Ontario, where Siobhan grew up. This is an open cut. This used to be a solid 3 to 4 foot wide vein of silver that's probably 100, 150 feet deep. And when you drive into town, there's all these like cuts into the ground. It's sort of like photography changed the landscape. And a lot of this landscape, before I was a full-time professional photographer, is what inspired Ed Bertinsky to do a lot of his well-known work. So the way the mines are set up is, I started photographing. I didn't know what I was really doing in terms of doing a long-term project compared to what I know now. I just thought, go there and take lots of pictures. I didn't understand editing or sequencing. It was just going to be an archive of photographs. So these are called head frames, and you can see the pickup truck in the lower left for scale. And this ore body, so we have multiple shafts in these head frames. The workers go down, equipment goes down, and the blasted rock comes up and gets processed in the mill. So these head frames, these buildings, are over one ore body, and these are massive. This is the Frood Stobie complex. So this mine, I mean, the mill for this mine, this mining complex in Sudbury, processes 41,000 tons of rock a day. Just the math of that. So these conveyor belts are where all the crushed rock come out. This is the Creighton mine. So these mines produced 40% of nickel for all Allied artillery in the Second World War. So we understand the scale of what these buildings belong to. This is the Creighton mine number 5 shaft. That's number 9 shaft. And those cables are connected to a wheel, a shiv. It's a wheel at top, and that lowers the elevator, the cage. That's what the name of the project is, cage call. And the cage call is the guy operates the elevator, rattles, and all the workers come in the cage and they go down. So, I think what this is a lot of urban sort of cities. It's kind of like we don't know where our meat comes from. We don't know where our supplies come from. It talks about this. This is a great quote from Charlie. And so there's a lack of representation. So there's like this, there's the city view and there's the rural or the workers view. Most mines are not in downtown big cities. They're off somewhere far away, somewhere else. This is the Caradison mine. This is where I did a lot of my photography. I don't know how I really got the access. I think my father knew a geologist. He worked at this gold mine, and he was into the arts. And he said, if you want to come and take photographs, and I just started going underground every day. And it was really, really fascinating because when you're underground, it's not like there's these like for gold. There are like these veins of gold you're seeing like in movies. It's very quite like, Treasure the Sierra Madre. Like, oh my God, I found gold. We understand like say gold rushes like California or the Yukon. To understand the scale of the mining going on in this region, the Yukon gold rush, the famous gold rush, produced 1 million ounces of gold. There are single mines in some of these mining towns that have produced 20, 30 million ounces of gold. That mine alone. Some towns that produce 100 million ounces of gold. So the scale is huge, and we have to ask ourselves in sort of myths and storytelling, sort of why don't we know about these places? So this is the bottom of the shaft. This is a miner at the bottom of the shaft. And this actually had available light. So he's asking some workers to lower some equipment down, and they're drilling down and lowering the shaft into the mine. And what was really incredible is these are the lights. This is a drilling a ramp that will spiral down so they can drive vehicles up and down in the mine. And these mines are complete cities with lunchrooms, a lot of some of the mines I worked in had no toilets. You kind of found an old drift and you did what you had to do, kind of like camping. But some more modern mines now have much more modern facilities, even like portalets, like a construction site. Older gold mines use timber. to support where the workers were going to work. And a lot of times I couldn't move around. I did a lot of portraits, or I would ask the miners, I'm going to stand on this pile of rock. Now, when I'm taking this photograph, I can't see the scene. This is lit with flash. All I see is that little lamp on his helmet, and I can take my helmet lamp off and kind of move it around. And I look down the waist level finder of my camera, and when I think it's right, I just shoot. But I'm in complete darkness when I'm taking these photographs. There's no light in these work areas. That's more what it looks like. I put a flash behind them, but it's too dark to actually take photographs with available light. All I'd see again is that little lamp on the miner head. So at times I tried to simulate what I would see, because the sensitivity of the actual film was not enough to make a proper picture that would be sharp. This is lit with flash. So every day I'd go down there, I'd have to like make sure there wasn't loose rock above my head or an open hole. So a lot of times activity moving was pretty limited, because I could fall down, get run over, get blown up by explosives. So every day was like safety sort of considerations. This is one of the deepest mines I went into. This is the Macassa mine in Kirkland Lake, and they're bolting screen and like these long 8-foot bolts into the rock to hold the rock from falling down on us. And I did do a lot of portraits. And what I learned about portraiture, I'd worked for Marilyn Mark for a long time, is there are two kinds of photos. And at the time I was doing this, Richard Avedon's American West was a really popular body of work, and something that kind of was a new way a new way for, at the time, sort of an exciting way of seeing portraits. And it's like photos we look into where people are doing something, and photos that look out at us and confront us. And I really started liking doing the portraits, as did the miners, because they felt like they could meet their viewers. So back to the mining process, this is the smelter. So if you're doing non-precious metals, so non-precious metals are nickel, copper, zinc, lead. This is the size of 2 football fields, and all your recycling goes to a place like this. And this emits gases, SO2, things like that. So when we think of like the price of paperless, like a paperless world where we're doing something for the environment, in some way we're always consuming something, right? So this is the smelter, where they sort of smelt out all the things they don't want, to sort of boil it down, sort of, to speak simply, down to copper or nickel. This is the outside of the smelter. In a lot of towns in the early days when they made discoveries, people build their houses all around where they worked, and they would just walk to work. Now things are much more spread out because of zoning, but this is the super stack in Coppercliff in Sudbury. Sudbury is probably got, I don't know, it's got about 20 mines at, I guess, at any one time, operating and not operating. It's originally the strike point of a giant asteroid. And when the asteroid hit, so this is before I was in North Toronto, pieces of the asteroid hit, flew so far off, I think they find them in Minnesota, which is pretty far away. And in that depression and on that rim is where all the mineralization of all the mines are. So in this particular case, an asteroid caused this big deposit of copper nickel to exist. This is the old Sudbury. You can still see this. NASA used to test vehicles because it looked like the moon, because the emissions were so bad. The emissions have a lot changed. They've improved a lot there. This is the old Coniston smelter. So the rock would be all black. And after all the mining, so let's talk gold mining. 1 ton of gold, if you get like an eighth of an ounce of gold in a ton of rock, that's like that's mineable, that's profitable. So after you take that 1/8 ounce out, so you crush it down, they use cyanide mostly in a process to remove the gold, liquefy it, and then all that crushed rock is kind of like a sand. They can put it back underground to fill the holes they made when they were mining, or they use a tailings pond, which is pretty hot. So this was a lake, and they filled it with filtered out, crushed, blown up rock, and so the lake fills up, and then there's no lake anymore. So a tailings pond is a part of the process. But what also struck me was sort of injuries. And I remember we started talking to the unions, like just in Ontario, in 100 years, over 100 years of mining, there were like 3,000 deaths just in Ontario in mines. And I just thought, workplace injuries. The highest number of workplace injuries is actually in construction. It's not mining, it's in construction. We just don't hear a lot about sort of these things that we see every day. So these are just miners, smelter workers who've had accidents. Sorry, I didn't say this guy worked in the smelter, and obviously when you melt metal, it's like molten red liquid metal. And I think it leaked out and poured into his boot. This was an electrician at a smelter. You know, you need a lot of electricity to mine. So we're talking about energy. In Canada, it's mostly nuclear, renewable a little bit. Not so much coal in Canada anymore. He got electrocuted. This guy worked in Bill, worked in a rock crusher, got his arm caught in a conveyor. You know, head injury from working underground. So, you know, Charlie did this great interview and he talked about flesh and steel, flesh and bone always lose to rock and steel. So this is Huey McInnes. He was a shaft miner, fell down the shaft in an accident, paralyzed for life. Here he is in his wheelchair shaving. And so the curator in the show in Toronto at the Image Center, which closes today, was Gal Morel. And I wanted to work with her for a very, very long time. And sorry, I'm trying to find my mouse. I'm trying to move the, oh, oops, I went there. Well, you can read this. Sorry, part of the pictures I can't see my cursor. So what I wanted the project to be about is when you think of Canada, right? Most of our population lives like right near the border, and as it goes north, there's this big emptiness where the kind of the roads end, but there are these small communities, all sort of part of sort of colonial legacy or resource extraction. And there's kind of, at least for the world, and especially like Canada, this vast land, it's like this myth of inexhaustibility. Like we're gonna be able to mine forever. We're gonna have it forever. And so I just think that, you know, coming back to that picture from the garbage bin from my art college is like this moral complexity that we're a part of the system. Right? So when I did the project, obviously I would try to publish. I was doing it on my own, and then I would go to a photo editor or publication and try and publish it like editorially. I collected ephemera. These are workers' time cards. What's really interesting about these time cards, if you look down, is it says Father in Rouen. That's a place in Quebec. It's a mining town. And it says RC. So they used to collect information, at least back then, is Roman Catholic. They would collect what religion you had. And then it says X-ray okay. So they would test you to see if your lungs were okay, that you'd have a lung disease from mining somewhere else. Then they would, you know, possibly not hire you, or it was an issue to do with compensation or not compensation. So book dummies. I edited with you know, I just want to take photographs. You know, I went to art college, so we didn't really learn about photo editing. It wasn't really till I worked at a newspaper that I started learning photo editing. And I took a photo editing workshop in Berkeley with Ken Light. And I started creating sort of book dummies of what a book could look like, an edit of like, you know, 50 to 100 photographs. So these are some of the early book dummies made with inkjets and photocopies. The first book I published was all architectural photographs with Charlie, called Industrial Cathedrals in the North. This is Cage Call. It's out of print now. You can find some copies, but this was a Photo Lucida book award. And this is sort of the editing I learned. And John G. Morris, Robert Capa's former photo editor and who worked with Magnum, the Washington Post, New York Times, helped me understand sort of editing aesthetics, like, you know, the light from the smelter and the right sort of echoing onto the next page, sort of like in the relationships, like large and small scale, sort of the large house and the small house in the frame. And these are sort of little things I learned, like echoes of two towers, echoes of two poles, and the texture on the ground. And this photo of these immigrant miners playing bocce ball and the texture on the ground of the mine. So I'm going to wrap up there. This is Siobhan's book. I already pre-ordered my copy. Get this book. I could never put into words sort of what she's explained and sort of what I've been photographing. And now we get to some Q&A.
All right. If you have any questions, please place those in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen there. I have a question for Louie. Louie, how has the reception been by the mining community? Did you have shows of the work earlier on, or you know, what is the feedback from that?
So you know, obviously, like the mining community is a lot of different communities. There's like the people who live in the town, there's the workers, and there's various views, like are they management in the mine, or are they the miners and the, you know, the miners, the workers themselves, or the union? and different towns have different politics depending on their labor history. And then there's the mining company as a community, and that's a community of, I mean, without the mining company, there's no miners. None of the miners have work, so they're kind of all interrelated. So no one did a project like this, like getting access to these mines. Even now, like even back then, most of the photographs were landscapes. I think that I sort of learned some innovative flash techniques to work underground. And so originally I thought, I'm really motivated. I want to do this project's about Canada. It's about photography. It's about our history of resource extraction. And so the companies are like, we're not giving you access. It doesn't fit in. This is not what we do. You know, they give a media tour once in a while, maybe to like someone reporting on a business related thing, but like art photography, like their words, it was like, no. And so, you know, I met that geologist that my dad knew, and he worked at the mine, and he thought, hey, this is good for history. But a lot of the photography were commissioned photographs by the companies for their annual reports or for their walls or just to show shareholders. So a lot of the photographs were, I don't want to say they were censored, but they were made in a positive light, you know, like you can't sneak into an underground mine. You know, I think when we look at Lewis Hines, like the child laborers crushing the coal, he snuck into those mines. There's so much security at these mines. You can't get down the shaft without someone taking you down there, and then you don't know where you're going in the dark anyway, and you can get blown up or killed. So what I did was I went to the local museum and said, hey, I'm doing a history project. And history was a word, not journal. History was a good word. And then the museum would know the mine manager, because usually the mines in these small towns sponsored the museum. So there was that approach. Then I thought of it as an art project that sort of resonated with some people. But then I had some exhibitions. I think it would have been around 2012, I think. And I think that there was this, you know, kids in these mining towns don't want to go work underground. They want to go to a big city and they want to work in an office. They don't want to work in a smelter or underground. It's still quite a dangerous job. Obviously, the safety is much higher now, mostly brought about by unions challenging governments and companies with safety rules. Strikes, a lot of that came out of strikes, workers' rights. But at times, people did not like seeing people missing arms and things. You know, I think that there are some companies who are like, we like these photographs. We can show this to our workers. Like, hey, be safe because this can happen to you. Or the families of the miners who are another community, they don't know where their husband, mother, father, they don't know where they work. They don't know what the workplace looks like. So I would have exhibitions in local museums, and the families would be coming to be like this. I didn't even think about it, but it was like this incredible moment, like, oh, that's where my dad works. And when you work in mining, it's kind of like you're a sailor, like you're on this famous ship that no one can ever go on, because they didn't really give tours to anybody underground. It's pretty dangerous. I mean, now it's a little better. They probably do it. Companies have improved a hell of a lot since even when I took these photographs. But it was mixed, and I got a lot of negativity. Like, hey, people don't want to work at the mine because you're showing the mine in a negative light, you know? Whereas I was just photographing it in a mode of transition. I think it's a really important part. It's kind of like, don't show January 6th. You're making the US government look better. That didn't happen, you know? And so I think sometimes things like that take a long time before people really want to look at it. But I think overall, I hassled some of the companies. I kept saying, hey, you know, I'm doing this project. They're just, okay, stop phoning me. We'll let you go in the smelter. But, you know, you have to go with someone or you can get killed, especially in the smelter. So it was mixed. The response was mixed. But I think now there's been a change and people are looking back and thinking, hey, this is an important part of Canadian history. And wow, we've changed our safety so much since those days. So it's kind of like, look where we are now and look how it used to be. So time has changed that. But initially, there are places that are like, you are never getting on our property. So
Janice asks, do you have unpublished photos from that time that you might think about publishing now?
yeah, so some of the photos, one or two, plus a few others. When I had the exhibition, I published a little, like a workers' newspaper, like a broadsheet that was available at the exhibition. They will eventually be on sale somewhere online. I just hadn't got to that. It's only like 10 photos, but the archive is big. And when we published, I mean, I was really like the indie punk band who could barely put a 45 out. You know, like I got that Photo Lucida project that helped, and there's some exhibitions. So two things. Yes, the body of work is massive. Like it's quite big. After the Image Center show, you know, reconnecting in a bigger way with Siobhan, with her brilliant writing and thinking, and a lot of other people, we are working on, it's not for sure, a traveling exhibition of the work. It's like 50 prints. They're all vintage prints. And I don't know about doing a publication. I'd love to, but right now we're working on, and it could travel around the US. We're in the early stages of organizing what that would look like logistically, but there's a lot of interest in that. So yeah, there are hundreds of unpublished photographs. I just went and took a lot of photos. I just kept taking lots of rolls, and I was processing them in my mom's laundry before I moved out, just after college. Like, so all these negatives are hanging in my mom's laundry, in my little darkroom under the stairs that I had. So, yeah, there is a lot, and I'm hoping to do more work with it. I think people have I thought of it like a workers project and a lot more simply than what Siobhan talked about, but now people are just thinking about it like the word materiality has changed the way people are thinking about it. So
Julie says, I started documenting abandoned mines in Northern Ontario around 2009, which is how I found your work, doing research for a few years ago, and have found that people aren't very happy with you poking around abandoned mine sites. Did you get permission? I think you spoke about that a little bit, but did you get permission? Were the locals happy to talk to you? I also wanted to comment that I loved industrial cathedrals and cage calls, since they show so many of the mine sites that I have been to that have since disappeared.
yeah, so I mean, Siobhan, the way I met Siobhan's parents is I was driving up north and someone said, stop in Cobalt. And I'm like, okay, what's this Cobalt place? Early, like 91 or 2. And I'm driving, I'm going up the main highways, Highway 11. It goes straight north from Toronto. And there's this, you have to go to Cobalt, you have to kind of go on this little turn off. And I'm driving, and there's like these vast, they almost look like massive bunkers from the First World War, these concrete crumbling structures. And I'm like, oh my God, look at, it's like a bomb hit this place. And I saw this little house, and I pulled in this back driveway, and I'm like, I just pulled up, I got out of the car, and I'm like looking. And then this woman comes out. She's yelling at me like, what are you doing on my property? That was Siobhan's mother. What are you doing on my property? I'm like, Jesus. And you jump in the Jeep and took off. And then I met these artists working in north of there in Kirkland Lake. And they're like, oh, I'm working with this writer, Charlie Angus. And they're like, we're going to Cobalt to hang out. I'm like, great. I'm like, whoa, I was down there and I got chased off this property. I don't know. I thought it was this back road. And we end up back at Siobhan's parents' house. Siobhan was quite small back then, but when I took these photographs, a new law came in, and it said that all mining companies have to return all their properties back to the original state, or they're not going to either get a permit to build a new mine, or they're going to get taxed, or they're going to have to pay fees. So they started tearing down all the buildings. And so I kind of slowed down on the underground photography, started photographing all the buildings before they tore them down. I think I photographed over 100 mine sites, somewhere like deep in the bush, in the forest. So, I think that a lot of times mines were abandoned. If there are fences, I mean, you can get charged for illegally trespassing. There were mining companies who were like really loose, like, hey, here's a letter, just jump the fence. That would never happen now. It's a different time back then. I'll just jump the fence. And sometimes the police would be waiting for me at my vehicle. And I had this letter on a letterhead saying, hey, you can go here. But then even then, mine security had different ideas, like get off the property. But at least where Siobhan lives, there are these vast, very big holes in the ground. They're quite dangerous, actually. So I'm maybe when I was younger, I'd be like, yeah, sure, let's go down there. I think now I'm a little more, I think, before I go. So I never wanted to get charged. So I never really liked jumping fences unless I had permission to, or if it was an abandoned mine, then I'd be very, very careful. But you never know. There's sinkholes, open holes, you could fall down. So, but also back there, and this, Julie, the black flies and the mosquitoes could drink a liter of your blood if you got out of the car to go photograph the mine. So anyone watching this, Northern Ontario, especially in the spring, you want to get there in the spring because the leaves haven't grown, so you can see the old mine. Some of the mine buildings are only like 20 feet high, especially in Siobhan's hometown of Cobalt. They're very, very small buildings. They would mine these very rich on the surface. Mining technology and engineering wasn't very sophisticated. But even sort of all the legacy of old mining in Siobhan's town, like all the lakes are filled with, they didn't really filter the arsenic, which is one of the chemicals they use to extract the silver out. Siobhan, I'm going to shift to ask you a question. So when you still go for walks. I see your dad on Facebook sometimes, and he's going walks. I'm walking by the old mine building, the tailings. So tell me sort of about growing up around that. What was that like?
Oh, I mean, I think that there's something, as photographers like Ed Bertinsky have really shown, there's something sort of strangely beautiful about that kind of post-industrial kind of context. And yeah, I mean, I think that, mining is one site, but Canada is an extractive nation, and more people than we would guess, right, kind of live in and around industry. I was born in Toronto, and there was a lead smelter kind of in our neighborhood, which is like not something that we really think about as a sort of urban history. But I think that, I think a body of work like yours kind of allows us to do reconnecting work. And I think that it's very easy, when we're kind of around factories or around mines or around legacy pollution, to kind of, you naturalize it, right? It's just kind of in the water or in the air, and we forget. Or, I mean, anyone in agricultural communities, right? The sort of chemicals from agriculture are actually like, one of the kind of more existential threats to human health and kind of long-term toxicity on the planet. And so I think that, my kind of interest in these histories is also probably a way of like denaturalizing that kind of destruction that becomes kind of so embedded around us. But, I think visually have always been really drawn to a kind of industrial sublime for that reason too, right? Seeing it on these different scales. So yeah, I guess like everything, it's sort of ambiguous and mixed, right?
Yeah, so for people who don't know, when I was working on the project and Siobhan was much smaller, we built something called the Angus Gold Mine. It was a made up little fake mine behind the house. And what's incredible is back then there was no digital phone, so it was like I feel like a shoe repair man with broken shoes. Like there's no, are there there? I wish there were photos of us, but myself, Siobhan, and her sister built this like fake little gold mine. We played pretend like we were miners in the backyard. Those are the fun days. So, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of like in some ways, it's a little more extreme, but war photography, it's like terrible beauty. So uh, and I'm just going to turn some questions on Siobhan because her sister has a coffee shop in Cobalt now, built in an old mine, actually. That was your parents' old magazine office, right?
It was, yes.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, so what do you think of that you meet old miners or retired miners and they talk about mines like old famous ships? And I always think of the Turner painting where they're like retiring the old sail ship before it goes to the industrial age of steam. Are there old retired miners that you've met in your time that have said something or shared something with you that struck you, that sort of started where you are now?
Oh, that's a great question. And I don't think I can answer it right away, but I'm going to
Yeah.
put the question back to you.
Because I met a lot with your father. Like, so, you'd meet these miners and they would talk about working in the mine. And so when we think of it as this terrible job, a lot of them turned it into something where it was their identity. That's kind of in this, I'm extracting this, so to speak, symbolically for you, Siobhan, of even those industrial sites, no matter how terrible they look, they're a part of where you grew up. Sort of like people grow up on farms and they have barns or horses or the grain silos, and sort of like these visual echoes of that's a part of who I am. So I always think of uh, uh, there's a great mining museum in Cobalt as well. So I've met miners like that, and there's something called high grading, and high grading is the act of, in a gold mine, finding high grade gold that you can see, which is rare, and stealing it or mining it, and then selling it either on the black market or companies high grade, meaning they mine only the richest part and let the rest of the mine not get mined, making it uneconomical. So no one really talk about that, because in the original days, miners would take this rich silver or gold and go down to Toronto to one of the big hotels where all the mine executives were, and sell high grade metals at the back door of the hotel. I think it was the King Eddie Hotel. So let's go back to the group here.
Yeah, Sage would like to know, or Sage says, I'm curious how you continue to think about the materiality of mining and photography in relation to your other bodies of work where the subject matter is very different. Does it still come into play?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to ever not think like, my dad was a stonemason construction worker. So my part-time job to pay for all my cameras, like mixing cement. So I always think of stone. Any place I go, even like the US Capitol or the White House, like someone built those places. In a lot of cases, slaves were used to build those buildings. But I always think, when you do something, when you do it, like picking up piles of stone and unloading them off the pallet or the forklift for the stonemason to start carving it and putting it up with the cement, you're like, wow, this really sucks, or this is really hard. And it's not the most exciting work for some people either. Uh, I'm always thinking of like, wow, like, my phone, like how many metals are in this? And I think that a lot of the narratives I hear from people is like some of the rare metals in our phones are from like the Congo, but no one ever thinks about, well, hey, you know what? A lot of them are probably from Canada. A lot of the jet fighters, all cobalt, the actual mineral cobalt, not the town. All these metals are in all the things we use every day. And that's, can be turned, from a company view, like, hey, without us, you can't make that stuff. But it also can be turned like, hey, what did you do to make that thing? Or do I owe it to the workers and myself if I want to fight for some kind of social justice, to be like, this is where it comes from, and I know that. And how in this world driven by capitalism where we consume things, how can I minimize the damage to things? So yeah, I always think about it. And sometimes I'm like, well, that's it. I'm not using any more film. I'm like, I don't know, digital could be even more destructive because you need, and I'm not canceling photography because I'm a photographer, but you need cloud storage and electricity and charging the battery. And, we're going to these like battery powered cars. Where does the lithium come from? Comes from mining. There was a line that I know Siobhan's dad liked called, if you can't grow it, you mine it. And it's kind of true. I think that without mining, we all the metals, surgical tools, wires, like the fact that we're having this lecture, electricity, is all from mining. And I think that especially in photography, there are alternate ways of doing things without metals, or there's alternate choices. But there is no photography without mining. And I think that we have to not separate where these things get made into like these museums where we don't want to look at it. I think we need to even more so bring it back and say, hey, I get this. And these are the things, these are the strategies we have to make sure we understand all of this, and that, we're making just investments or just use of some things. So I'm always thinking about it. I just think of like, I like to think of like, where's my Uber driver from? Did most of them, at least here in DC, are immigrants, probably from war-torn countries. So I'm always trying to think of that. I'm always trying to consider it. I'm not perfect. We're all using something that's not perfect, but I think acknowledgement is, I think a lot of people who are in these places that have extractive industries, I think the acknowledgement is all they're really looking for.
Janice says, would you consider bringing that traveling photo exhibition to Northern Ontario mining communities? Many of the miners
definitely.
and mining families
we
would find this to be deeply meaningful to them, as would I, as a miner's daughter and advocate.
Yeah, I've shown the work mostly in mining towns, small scale shows. And we did one bigger one in Sudbury, but that was a long time ago. And that was one that got controversial because some of the companies were like, we can't find workers or to get kids to come work in the mines. And I just thought, hey, I think mining's important. You can get killed or hurt in any job. Construction sites even more dangerous. But when 2 or 3 miners get killed underground, it's the headlining news. It's not the photography that's doing it. But I do think, yes, we will be trying, if we can work it out. Obviously, touring a show costs a lot of money, frames, mats, and the actual transportation of the work itself, and then having a venue. So definitely, I know who asked that question. So you could just message me on Facebook because I follow her.
Sage says, I also wanted to commend you for your persistence and dedication to taking on such an ambitious and important project earlier in your career. Do you think that accomplishing this hard thing when so many people said no to allowing access contributed to your success in working in other very difficult locations?
Yeah. So when I took that project on, one of the bodies of work that I looked at that I still think is one of for documentary photography, best sequenced books is In Flagrante by Chris Killip. He's passed away, but he was a British photographer, and he kind of photographed this period in the UK that was kind of the end of, sort of one of the sort of ends of the British Empire, is at the Thatcher era, coal miners' strikes, but a lot more in sort of this end of the UK as this world empire. And when I took my project on, I mean, that would be a hard project now with 30 years of experience. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. And I feel like I missed so many photos. There are so many things I could have done differently, but I'm very happy with the resulting work. And yeah, like I went underground. I took some pictures. I thought, wow, I don't even know how to use my flash down there. Like, this is so different. Basically, it's total blackness. Like the way you expose the film, process the film chemically, how long you have to change all of that to allow for either shadow detail. For 3 or 4 years, I had to try different films and different processing times. I processed nearly all of the film on my own, like in a little tank, hundreds of rolls, 3, 4 rolls at a time. Because I was broke. I was working in bars at the time. I wasn't really doing too many assignments. I graduated at school into the 1991 recession, and there were no safety nets in that recession. And I think there were times where I literally drove up north and slept in my Jeep in the mine parking lot. And every morning, the miners would come and knock on my total condensation windows to like time to go underground. So, and I had like a pack of bologna, and I would leave it out on the roof of my truck, or my Jeep, I mean, so it would stay cold. And then I would make my breakfast. It's kind of ridiculous, the things I did to get the project done. But I really felt like it meant something, and I think it definitely drove me to get to this point where I do acknowledge like workers and unions, because a lot of the miners like, why are you photographing us? Like, why aren't you off on like a tropical island on a beach? And this is what they're thinking. And I'm thinking, oh, because this is kind of like a social issue, like my parents telling me their oral histories of the Second World War. So it set me up first socially and politically in how I think of things. But technically and access wise, it definitely pushed me to be very innovative and creative in getting access.
Thank you. Julie says, would you ever think about doing a then and now comparison of the work, like showing the vacant sites where the head frames used to be? For example, Kerr is just a single building, some ruins, and a giant hole now.
I thought of going back up there and doing some new work. I think just economically back then in the 90s when I did this, you could like really like a punk rock band on a tour, but now everything's more expensive, everything's more complicated. Security is way different. I'd like to go up and just sort of reinterpret sort of in a more conceptual, complex way. If I could find a commission to go up north, I have ideas around sort of re-engaging with those communities, but I have to find funding for that. It's the old days. I have no work. Let me go in my vehicle. I'll work in a bar for 3 nights, get some cash, fill up my gas tank, and go north. Squat for free at the Angus house up north, which I did. I slept on every couch and floor possible. before going to other mine sites. But yeah, it's a plan, a hope of mine. So yes.
And I wanted to ask Siobhan about your book and how that came to be. And I know you mentioned going on a book tour soon. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, the book has been, I guess, a decade in the works in different forms. And I mean, its origins, I think, probably date back to Louie's body of work, right? Sort of this early fusion of photography and the mine. But the book kind of takes a kind of broad view and looks at 6 different mined materials that have been used as light sensitive materials in the history of photography. So bitumen, silver, platinum, iron, uranium, and rare earth elements, and then tracks the sort of visual and extractive histories of that. Louie's work is included in the book, but it's really an attempt to think through these questions of environmental justice. And I think that there's a tendency sometimes in photo studies to ask a lot of photographs, to ask a lot of photographers. And I think that what makes photography kind of interesting in this context is its embeddedness in these kind of in these systems, right? Photography has never existed outside of the global spread of capitalism, and it's been used as a tool within that since its inception. But I think because of that embeddedness, it's also a really powerful place to initiate critique, especially in the context of something like extraction, where there's no real outside from it, which is not to say there aren't different levels of responsibility, but all of us to a certain degree are kind of conscripted into this world that is really built on extraction. And so I think kind of sitting in those tensions feels really important. So the book comes out in late March, and I'm doing a kind of series of talks and events. The dates are sort of being finalized now, but everything will be posted on my website, and you can also find me on Twitter as well. But thank you for that question.
Didn't I hear a rumor you might be going to LA for part of the book? Maybe promotion?
Yes, but I don't have a date yet, so.
Okay. Keep an eye on Siobhan on social media. What social media are you on, Siobhan?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram.
Okay. I follow
Yes.
her, so you should follow her too.
Yes, possibly even with LACP if we can work it out.
I'd love that.
Are there any, if you have any other questions, feel free to type those in the Q&A. We have just a few more minutes left, and so any burning questions?
I can answer Louie's earlier question.
Oh, let's go. The miners,
Yeah.
miners you met, because there's some classic characters in where you grew up.
Yeah, but I think that the kind of main kind of takeaway from, spending kind of growing up in and around mining, but then also kind of going back to it through this like art history lens, thinking with artists, thinking about exhibitions. And, some of the feedback I got a lot from sort of scholars and curators is this question of exploitation, right? Are these kind of images of labor? Like, what are the power dynamics? How does exploitation play in? And then when you go to communities and you talk to workers, right, they're really proud of the role that they play. And they're very conscious of their kind of embeddedness within this kind of, complex dance between labor and capital, and, the kind of like labor organizing and militancy. And so I think that sometimes and I think a lot of this comes like through these histories of coal mining, which is, as Louie said, a very different history than hard rock mining. But I think that, there's a lot in these photographs that are kind of like assertions of the role that workers play. And I think that they're a really kind of powerful testament to that. And again, when we think about these histories of labor organizing, so many, especially in Canada, right, so many of the kind of labor protections that we have were won in mining communities, because these are really organized, really centralized sites. And so I think that it's not just this kind of, sort of dark history, right, where, we see labor exploitation and environmental degradation, and then the like kind of elevated nature of the art institution or photography. But I think that there's like lessons that cut both ways. And there's a lot we can learn by, you know, kind of thinking about those labor histories more and kind of taking them seriously as woven throughout all of these processes.
Yeah, I think what I would love to add and just make a little conversation in case no other questions come in is just so people understand out there, like a lot of hard rock miners, the skills they have to drill in the rock. And I mean, you got to be able to drill, load explosives, blast, look around for safety, test for gas. I mean, and go on and be able to operate machinery. Uh, the days of, like 200 years ago where it was the only job and you were forced to do it, a lot of miners can make over $100,000 a year or even more. There are pay incentives. And yes, there are still ways that some companies, but not all, try and take advantage of workers, or there's conflict between the companies and the workers over how much the company is profiting versus how much they're sharing with the community or the workers. But it's not the days where, you went to work and you got, by the end of it, the company town, you had no money and the company controlled everything. I think that there are still very sophisticated ways in which some companies who are quite exploitive of their workers still take advantage, especially if they're outside of places where, like United States or Canada, where there are pretty serious labor laws now. But it's true what Siobhan says. A lot of these miners are really proud that they're miners. They like working a lot. If they don't want to work in the mine, they leave. It's not like 100 years ago where it was the only job in town. uh just shaft sinking, like drilling down and operating that kind of equipment. I mean, some miners who do very specific types of jobs are in demand all over the world. There are groups of miners that work as contracting companies who get hired all over the world to put in that first mine shaft, because it takes a very skilled group of workers to follow an engineering plan to literally drill what is like a 30-foot diameter hole down 3,000 feet in the ground so they can put an elevator shaft in it. It's not like building a building, above ground going up. It is very complex. Rock is not always going to want you to do what you want it to. You got to pump water out of it. You got to know what the signs of danger are like. So it's true. There is, especially in town, there's a very big pride, but also there's a big pride in like, hey, this is our town. This is our town. And if you think you're going to put a mine here and tell us what to do, now there are going to be times where it's contentious. But also, when I did go out and take these photographs, it had to be very planned and executed. I couldn't just, it's not like street photography. A lot of these towns, I spent years getting to know people. I lived with them a lot of times, especially when it was medium format film photography. It's not like I could take photos from the hip, especially when you're not from those mining towns. People, like, if there's a photographer on the street, they're going to notice you right away. And on the mine sites, a lot of the miners are like, wow, something new in our workplace. Come into Louie, come with us. And they work in pairs usually. And they're like, no, 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 Louie, don't go with those guys. Come with us, because I broke the monotony of the workplace. And I would eat with them underground. I'd literally sit in the dark on a pile of rock taking photographs all day, or I'd have to wait for after 3 hours of drilling, because I can't just walk around. I could get killed or hurt. I have to wait till they finished. And the window of photography in an 8 to 10 hour shift was like maybe 15, 20 minutes or half an hour. I couldn't just take photos however I wanted, because I'd be flashing them and I could blind them all and they could get hurt. So a lot of it is not that it's set up, but I would say, hey, when can I take those? Okay, we're going to do this thing. You can take photos during this. Or that's how portraits came about, because I could stop anything that would hurt or kill us and take photographs. So when you get to these towns and you're either in an old cafe or bar and you're talking to a miner, the tales are incredible. Some of the stories of how things happen in the mine. So anyway, I just thought I'd want to put that out there, because I don't want people looking at, and for the sake of the miners and communities too, they're not like, we hate the mining company, we hate the mine. A lot of them get along with the mining company, and there are a lot of different kinds of mining companies now. There are some mining companies that have thought, hey, the old ways are not the way to do it anymore. We want the permit. We don't want to destroy the environment. We we want there are these pretty serious environmental laws in Canada now. That's not to say there aren't mining companies that do harm. They do. But there are a lot of new mining companies that have taken a new approach to it because the old way, mostly because of unions fighting for things, they know they won't be in the mining business very long if they do operate in the old way.
Great. Well, I think we're about finished for today. Are there any closing thoughts or anything else you want to leave the folks with?
Siobhan, what are you researching now? You doing anything new?
Yeah, in my camera geologica, I look at the 19th century and then the present, but I totally skip the 20th century because in the 20th century, you get synthetics and everything changes, right? So now I am trying to tackle synthetics, which is very challenging in different kinds of ways because it's, this kind of like petrochemical history of photography instead. So we'll see how it goes. Stay tuned, but
Cool.
that's what I'm thinking about.
Thank you to the LACP and thank you, Matthew, for hosting us and allowing us to have this great community building moment across geography and just talking and acknowledging sort of this history. I really appreciate it.
Oh, we appreciate you guys so much. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you, Siobhan. Good luck with your book. I hope it will I hope it will be everything you want it to be. And thank you, Louie, for sharing your photography. And we look forward to seeing both of you again in the future.